So, I mean, I do want to talk about more just the future under COVID. I do want to ask that as a policy student, and I know we have a lot of students listening to this podcast. What should we learn from this book? What should we learn about how the U.S. will operate in the future global order?
I honestly wouldn't be too worried about the United States. The U.S. is going to take a few years off, probably 20 or 30, and it's probably not going to become involved again until one of two things happens. Number one, the political breakdown of the two parties that started with the Obama administration completes its cycle. So that means what we used to think of as Democrats is gone. What we used to think of as Republicans are gone. The labor unions are no longer Democrats. Fiscal conservatives, military conservatives are no longer Republicans. The Democratic Party is basically a mess that's kind of been hijacked by the far left wing, and the Republican Party has become a vehicle for the personality of Donald Trump and nothing else. This isn't sustainable. It can last for another 4 to 8 years, but eventually we will get new parties out of this. The factions will move. For example, the labor unions are now part of the Trump team, which is something that the Democratic leadership still hasn't come to terms with. But once we have functional political parties again, then the two parties can start having an actual debate about what sort of foreign policy we need. And we will start discussing what our actual goal is. Once we have a goal, then we can start debating policy. So we will get there. That's a 10, 20-year process. Option number 2, something will scare us again. I don't think that's going to happen anytime soon. There just are no countries out there that have the capacity to threaten the United States economy or the United States militarily. So it's going to take 10, 20 years for a country like Turkey or like Japan to strengthen, to expand their influence, and then start to butt up against American perceived interests. But the candidates for that are actually pretty thin. It's not going to be Argentina. Argentina's going to need 50 years before it might be able to dominate South America. It's unlikely to be Japan. And strategically, it looks like they'd be the most likely candidate. But if there's any country that can appreciate what it means to step on America's toes, it's Japan. And they have kind of defined their entire foreign policy establishment about avoiding that. And so of all the countries that the United States had as allies during the Cold War and the post-Cold War era, Japan has been the most aggressive at seeking out future American partnership and is actually, putting their supercarrier fleet that is being developed under American naval control in the Pacific. They want to make sure they never cross the Americans again. France and America are likely to get along great. They're our oldest friend for a reason, and we squabble like siblings, but for the most part, it's collegial. That just leaves Turkey. And honestly, the Turks and the Americans really don't have any overlapping interests. So we're kind of powers that kind of look the other way whenever one of them is doing something that they don't like, but it really doesn't hit our core strategic needs or economic exposures. So there's no clear candidate here. And it's going to take a generation for the global system to shake out and for those 4 other powers to kind of consolidate control over their own regions. And then maybe the United States will see something that kind of spooks it. But honestly, I think the internal restructuring is more likely first. And it's difficult to say what American strategic goals or American ethics are going to look like 30 years from now. So predicting who our next dust-up is going to be with is kind of a fool's errand. That and I'll be in my 70s, and I probably won't care so much by then.
One country we haven't talked about, and I thought this was interesting, if you look at who the U.S. deems to be its biggest enemy. In the Obama era, is about 30% Russia, 20% China. Now it's about 20-20 each, and Mexico got 9 or 10% of that. So, which is insane, of course. But you talk a lot about the strategic partnership between Mexico and the U.S. How do you see that playing out in the next however many years?
I know this is going to sound crazy, but Mexican-American relations right now are the most positive they have been in the history of both republics. And honestly, it was the Central American migration surge that sealed the deal. People like to talk about racism in this country, but sometimes they forget that other countries is just as racist as we are. And the Mexicans think as badly of the Central Americans, worse, arguably, than Americans do. So when Donald Trump laid down the law and said that Mexico absolutely had to act as the wall for us, and that Mexican authorities had to break up those migrant caravans and send everybody back to Mexico, the Mexican government was quietly thrilled because it meant they had full diplomatic cover to do what they wanted to do anyway. And between that and the NAFTA 2 negotiations, which between Mexico and the United States were pretty friendly. We now have a stronger political, military, economic, and cultural relationship than we have ever had with any other country ever. And, you might not believe that from the news on our side of the border, but honestly, things are going pretty well. Could they be better? Could we have a president on both sides who maybe is a little bit more in tune with the long view is? Of course. But I mean, these are two countries that have fought a couple of wars. One of them stole territory from the other one. We're at different stages of the economic cycle. We're at different stages of economic development. There's not a lot of reason to believe that bilateral relations should be friendly, and all of a sudden they are. And that is absolutely a testament to just how flexible the Mexican president AMLO has been and just how willing Trump has been to throw out the rule book. In this case, it's worked, and it's worked well.
Do you see Mexico, I've read, becoming the China of the, Western Hemisphere? Does that make any sense to you? Or do you think it's more to be this reciprocal relationship, but where the U.S. is ultimately the senior partner?
Oh, the U.S. is absolutely the senior partner. I mean, the United States has triple the population of Mexico. There's no doubt about that. But Mexico is our largest trading partner, became our largest trading partner last year. It has a young population that is absorbing a lot of American exports. So it's our largest export destination. These are positions it will not give up in our lives. And as Mexico moves up the value-added scale, we're going to see more and more integration in terms of economic and manufacturing and ultimately finance. But what we're seeing now is a stall and probably a reversal of the cultural's not what I'm going for, the demographic intermingling. Net migration from Mexico has been negative for 10 years. And for the last 5 years, more Americans moved to Mexico than vice versa. So, there is an invasion going on, but it's going the other way. So that is going to change the nature of the relationship. And I think one of the great things that the Trump administration has been willing to admit is that this is not the relationship that it was 20 years ago. Trump has stopped hammering on Mexico on issues of trade because he realizes it wasn't resonating even with his own coalition, because the relationship now is very, very favorable. Mexico is good at the low and the mid end of manufacturing. The U.S. is the high end of design. So the propensity for trade there is huge. Mexico has a young population that absorbs a lot of American exports. They're our largest partner. And now the demographic situation has changed completely. And it's becoming, I don't want to say a relationship of equals, because it's not. I mean, this is still an economy that's like about 1/8 the size of the American economy. Even if Mexico doubles its GDP in the next 10 years, it's still going to be like 1/7 the size of the U.S. economy, because the U.S. economy is still going to grow. But it is a partner. And it is on a partner on all of the issues that we care about. I don't mean to suggest they're a first world country. I don't mean to suggest that Mexico is about to become a first world country. But this is a country that bit by bit is remaking themselves in a new mold. My biggest concern for Mexico moving forward is they're probably going to have a constitutional crisis in the next 2 or 3 years. Remember that they only shifted to kind of a civilian authority with free and fair elections, 15 years ago. So to have a new constitution to deal with this new environment makes a lot of sense. But constitutional referendums and constitutional tinkerings and rewrites, it's a traumatic experience. Most countries do not enjoy the process. Mexico will not either. It'll be interesting to see whoever emerges from the presidential election here in November, just how much understanding we're willing to consider and extend to Mexico in that sort of environment, because we don't want to be perceived as meddling, because that'll just backfire. But there will be structural trauma from this, and that will impact security cooperation, and that will impact the economic issues, and that will impact the demographic situation between the two states. I don't want to say it's doomed for conflict or it's doomed for failure, because that's not what I'm after. But change is hard. And if that change is happening at the same time that the global order is breaking down and the COVID recovery is kicking in, it's going to be awkward. And AMLO is absolutely not the person to lead Mexico through that. It's too much about him. So this is a problem for the next American president and the next American president. And that's going to be colorful.
Well, speaking of change, I do want to talk about oil as well. And
Sure.
Seeing as you wrote the book on shale, I think prices today were around $24 for WTI. not the prettiest sight. What do you see as the next 5 years of shale oil looking like?
Sure. Well, let me start with the short term. The Russian-Saudi price war is threatening to fill up all global energy storage, which will send prices lower, and even negative. That's where we're going to be for the next 3 to 6 months. In that time, we are going to see a lot of crude oil production fall offline, with probably the more vulnerable oil producers being either those that are landlocked like Alberta, those with questionable security records like Nigeria, or those who are under some sort of sanctions regime or incompetent leadership like Venezuela or Iran. All told, we're looking at probably in excess of 20 million barrels per day. That's 20% of global production just fallen offline. And a lot of that is not going to come back online for years, because investors are going to have confidence to go back into places that are sketchy. And with the global order breaking down, that's just not going to, that environment's gone. It's in the rearview mirror. So shale specifically is likely to lose 3 million barrels a day this year. That's about 20% of 20% of national output. That's a big deal. But from the point that a shale operator starts drilling to the point first oil comes out of the ground, 6 weeks. If the Saudis want to take production that they have set aside specifically to serve as surge production, that takes 90 days, twice as long. And then if you want to do something offshore Nigeria, you're talking a decade. So whenever prices do pop back up, U.S. shale will just surge out to fill the gap. So we're going to have different players. A lot of small players are going to go out of business. A lot of inefficient players are going to go out of business. Larger players, whether it's Occidental or Exxon, are going to pick up the pieces. But U.S. shale undoubtedly will fail to provide the United States with net energy independence this year because of the fall off. But by the end of next year, it'll be back already. And then we'll see production increase apace. The biggest complication that we're going to see midterm in the shale sector is that the product suite that Americans like, a diesel-heavy, gasoline-heavy mix, is not something that is well suited to shale production. Shale production is too light, too sweet. But honestly, they're just going to have to get over that, because as the global system breaks down and as multiple crude streams fall offline, this is what American refiners will have to deal with. And the process isn't going to be pretty, and it's not going to happen overnight, but it will happen. And honestly, it will be cheaper than what it takes to build out a refinery complex to run on the heavy sour stuff that most of the rest of the world is stuck with. So we will be just peachy here. The real interesting thing for me with the shale revolution is what happens next. Natural gas is a byproduct of shale oil production. The United States now gets about half of its electricity from natural gas, and we're using natural gas in our petrochemical sector. So we were seeing a broad-scale reindustrialization of the United States because of that factor before COVID, before everybody decided that they hated the Chinese. And we were already seeing the most rapid reindustrialization of the country ever, even more so than the sprint industrialization that we did during World War II. And now we have a health crisis to drive along further. We have a China crisis to drive it along further. So the pace of these evolutions is really going to accelerate in the next year or two. And if you want to fast forward to 5 years, the United States will have adjusted its refining system. The United States will be net independent. And with the exception of probably Alberta, will probably not be taking much crude oil from really anywhere else in the world, because Venezuela will be gone and the Eastern Hemisphere will just be a mess.
I was going to ask, what does that make for OPEC in that period? Do you think that will fall apart along with the
I mean, that's kind of a false question. For the last 20 years, OPEC has really just been Saudi Arabia, right. And maybe with adjuncts of Kuwait and the United Arab Emirates. And really those three are the ones who make the decisions. Those three are the ones who increase production or cut production. Everybody else just pumps as much as they can. It just makes the Saudis eat the difference anyway. Saudi Arabia, well, the Arab states of the Persian Gulf will be important energy players as long as they can maintain their independence, which is one of the reasons why the Saudis are starting to sniff around for a replacement security guarantor. The problem is that so many countries have to go buy so many other countries in order to get to the Persian Gulf to load up the crude, that the network of alliances and relationships and bribes and privateering that is going to define global oil trade is something that the world just doesn't have any active practice in. People forget that when the United States made the world safe for global commerce, that meant for everybody, even if you weren't part of the alliance network. And that's one of the reasons you can take a slow-moving super tanker and send it to Japan. It takes 2.5-3 weeks to get there, and nobody touches it. That's going to change. People are going to have to basically pay the Indians protection money to be paid in oil, probably. Pirates in Southeast Asia, that's going to get really dicey. And the longer that you've got the Japanese and the Koreans and the Taiwanese and the Chinese kind of bickering over the details over who's in charge in Northeast Asia, that's just going to be a no-go zone for tankers unless they're under convoy. And with the exception of the Japanese, no one can really convoy. So it's not that Saudi isn't going to matter. It's not that Saudi's version of OPEC isn't going to matter, but the picture is going to become so much messier as soon as the strategic cover of the American Navy disappears. Countries are going to have to take matters into their own hands. Oil trade is going to be more local, more regional. And if it is long-term, it's going to have to be guarded. And that means we get naval competitions. And through all of this, the Americans kind of look over at the Eastern Hemisphere and it's like, wow, what a mess. Why would we ever go back? And until we get scared, we're not going to.
Yeah, I guess any alliance like OPEC Plus that relies on Russian and Saudi cooperation is not meant long for this world.
Yeah, the Russians have never deliberately cut production ever, and they're not about to start now.
I don't think the Russians have deliberately done anything for another country, but cutting oil, definitely. So, and something else that's made into your newsletter recently is food security. This is obviously a rapidly changing event, but I know you, as a native of Iowa, know quite a bit about food processing and what perils COVID might bring. So what do you see as the how this develops over the next few weeks, I guess?
Sure. For the next 3 to 6 months, we don't expect any problems with production. So whether it's wheat or corn or soy or pistachios or cherries or dairy or beef or whatever, production's fine. The financial system is good. It's very liquid. There's a lot of bailout money to keep producers going. The problem is going to be getting the food to the consumers. And even there, the problem is limited. So corn processing, soy processing, nuts processing, fruit processing, all of that is fine. Just the very nature of food processing in all of these industries, if things get irradiated, there's social distancing, it's easy to do. There are only 2 subsectors that I have any concerns. The first is vegetables. A lot of that is done with migrant labor, and they live in dorms. So it's difficult to social distance while they're harvesting, and it's impossible to social distance when they're at home. That can threaten the workforce. The other one is meat processing, because social distancing there is almost impossible. A cow, weighs a half a ton, and that is not a one-man job to process that. And even once it's broken down, then the meat processing into things like sausage or hamburger also is relatively close quarters. And most of these workers are migrants, which means they're also living in bunkhouses. So what we've seen in the last 2 weeks is an explosion of cases throughout the meatpacking sector. We probably have about 1/3 of the country's meatpacking capacity for pork and beef offline right now. For the most part, this does not apply to chickens because, that's a chicken. One dude can handle that. You can do that from 6 feet apart. So
about 10 chickens on a run yesterday, so we're okay.
It's like, you can do social distancing fairly easy. So you might have a slightly slower processing speed, but it's nothing like the big hulks of meat with the carcasses for pork and for beef. And so that's where we've been seeing the disruption. So what we're doing right now is kind of threefold. Number one, they're getting better personal protection in. Number two, they're running extra shifts with fewer people. Normally, these facilities run 2 shifts a day, 6 days a week. Well, they're starting to do some shifts on Sundays. They're starting to do a 3rd shift. There's a little spare capacity to expand into, but if you're only going to put 60% of the people in for any shift, that's still a slowdown. Mm-hmm. What it does is allow you to better prevent the spread within the facilities. And then third, a very, 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 very aggressive testing system in the bunkhouses, among the staff, at entry, at breaks, in the cafeteria, basically almost a Chinese-style testing regime. And once you detect somebody who has been infected, you yank them out of there, you quarantine the people around them. Now, all of that works, but all of that slows throughput again. So until we get a situation where this is a little bit more under control, we are going to have insufficient meat processing. And because from the point of infection to the point of first symptoms is usually 5 to 6 days, that asymptomatic period is a real problem. We're just going to have to deal with a little bit less meat for the next couple of months. My biggest concern moving forward for the country at large is not so much that states are reopening too soon, although they probably are. It's that we just haven't built up our testing regimen enough among things like nursing homes or prisons or meat processing or any place where people congregate in close quarters to really limit it. So we're basically condemning the people who work in the meatpacking plants to kind of live in concentration camp conditions, but yet expect them to not get exposed. And we just haven't figured out how to do that yet.
America at least has the good fortune of all this is happening within its borders. What does food scarcity look like for countries that have to import quite a bit of food? Or at least which countries are those?
So that was the situation here for the next 3 to 6 months. I don't expect a problem with supply. I expect a system with processing a couple subsectors. For the rest of the world, we are looking at a number of countries, whether it's Congo or Egypt or Pakistan or Indonesia, countries that import a fair number of food facing economic breakdown because of COVID. It's not that there's not enough food out there. It's that the countries that need to import it have lost their livelihood. And so we can have famine and low food prices at the same time. And that's what we're likely to see this year. Now, what happens if you're a farmer, you're not getting enough money to justify you operating? You reduce your plantings. So 2021 is likely to be a year of insufficient food supplies and higher prices, which will, of course, hit all of these weaker countries all the same way. They just won't be able to afford it. So we are going to have a food crisis, not in this country, in the wider world. Remember, the United States is the world's largest agricultural exporter by a large margin. What we have is a processing and supply chain problem. These can be solved in a few weeks to months if we're willing to. And as soon as we have a shortage of pepperoni, I can guarantee you we're going to figure this out. But if there's not enough food produced for next year, that's going to be catastrophic for a number of countries. One of the things that the global order has enabled is created a trade system where you can export widgets or crude or iron ore and then import food. So you can take your people out of subsistence agriculture and put them into some sort of industry. Well, if the American strategic cover is gone and COVID's changed the math of the numbers of how you justify what you produce, we are going to have global food shortages, and that is going to result in famine.
So, we talked about a lot of upsetting things that COVID is costing. I always think back to the QE back from the financial crisis. It has been linked with food prices rising in the Middle East and the Arab Spring. What contagion do you think of all the efforts the government is doing, all the shortages we're having and the gluts we're having? What contagion are we not paying attention to? What do you think will arise that everyone is not talking about?
Well, the Chinese are going to have a financial implosion at some point. I'm not 100% convinced that COVID is going to be the proximate trigger, but it very well could be. I'd say about half of investment funds in the country have some sort of developing market exposure, and the majority of those have gone out of their way to get some China exposure. And honestly, I think that's just absolutely asinine. Here's a series of stock markets that are basically nothing more than slightly regulated casinos. And to think that that's not going to blow up in everybody's face, I think is just stupid. So when that does go down, we're going to have some financial adjustments around the world that are inevitable. Now, for the United States, that's not necessarily a net loss. It's not just an issue of whether or not you think we should be connected to the Chinese system or not. I obviously have my own opinions on that. But every time there is any sort of general economic dislocation anywhere in the world, you get a flood of capital flight. And the vast majority of that has always come to the United States because the US dollar is a store of value. The US dollar is supported by the largest economy, and the US dollar is not dependent upon international trade, so it doesn't fluctuate as much. And look at what's happened in just the last week. The German Constitutional Court yesterday ruled that unless the European Central Bank changes the way they manage the euro, that they will forbid the Bundesbank, the German central bank, from participating in monetary policy at the European level. That's the end of the European bond market. That's the end of the European currency. So what do you think? Even if they work that out, what do you think that means for investment flows from Europe to the rest of the world? We're going to see record levels of capital flight, things that are going to dwarf what we saw during the financial crisis coming to the United States because there's no alternative. We've got Brexit, which has basically removed the UK from global finance. Hell, the prime minister was in hospital for a couple of weeks, and they still have no future trade relationship with either the European Union or the United States. They're off on their own. So Britain, to act as an intermediary, much less as a store of value, is gone. The Chinese tried to, take over the world financially a couple of years ago, and they got into the IMF basket as if that really means anything. And what happened is they opened their currency account and expecting all this money to flow in to bet on the Chinese story, and $1.5 trillion US dollars equivalent fled the country in less than 6 months. So they locked it back down. They will never open that again. The Chinese government knows that nobody wants their currency. Next up is Canada. The Canadians run a relatively tight fiscal ship, but this is a country in demographic decay. It's actually looking at collapse. And they now have a secessionist problem out in the Western provinces. And Quebec and Ontario have never gotten along. So, that is not a store of value. Your next one down is Australia. Australia is a solid country that will probably be facing the worst depression in its history for the next decade. After that, we've got Sweden, Denmark, New Zealand. That's all of the world's hard currencies. Even if you don't like the United States politically, culturally, economically, strategically, financially, so where else do you go? And we're just seeing this recognition starting to pop up throughout the entire financial community globally as they realize that there are no alternatives. Think of what the U.S. has done in the last 6 weeks. We have issued $3 trillion of fresh spending, not a dime of which was backed up by new revenues. It is all deficit spending. And the Federal Reserve only had to only had to print currency to buy up about $1.5 trillion of it. The rest of it was just absorbed in moments by foreign investors looking for anywhere to put their money. And despite $3 trillion of new debt, the dollar went up at a time where the United States is the first world country facing the greatest coronavirus recession. I mean, that if nothing convinces you as to the inevitability of the US dollar for the next generation, hopefully that will.
I think that's great punctuation on your book and this podcast. Before you go, I know you're doing a lot of press for Feeding America. That's a link to your newsletter. If you want to say a quick bit about that, go ahead.
Sure. Here at Zeihan Geopolitics, we basically make our living on chaos and dysfunction. And the world has been very good to us in that regard for the last few years.
It's a booming.
Yeah, coronavirus is definitely not what we had in mind when we were planning to expand, although we are. And so we're going out of our way to not seek bailout money and things like that. And we're not taking money for our newsletters, which are always free. So you can go to Zeihan.com/newsletter and sign up for free. It will always be free. But what we do ask is if you find the newsletter useful, that you put a donation in to Feeding America. It is a nonprofit that basically takes parts of the food supply system that for whatever reason aren't working, and the food is no longer getting to the people, and then finds a way to match it up. So, for example, about 40% of all the foodstuffs that are consumed in the country are absorbed by college dorms, school lunches, and restaurants. Well, those are currently shut down. And so packaging that is necessary to supply a restaurant is not what you're going to buy in a supermarket. I mean, when was the last time you bought a 100-pound rasher of bacon, for example? So Feeding America buys this stuff that is available but has nowhere to go, and they use it to help people who can't help themselves in this current crisis. And a little goes a very long way. $1 will feed one person for 3 days. And they have no overhead. It's all donated. So 98% of every donation goes to the food program, not to management.
A rare happy note on the Slavic Connection. Well, thank you very much, Peter. It's a pleasure to have you on, and I'm excited for what's next.
You guys take care.
Thank you for listening, everyone. If you want to find more of Peter's work, you can go to ZeihanOnGeopolitics.com. The charity he mentioned is called Feeding America. I never say this, but please like and comment and say nice things to me if you see me. It really means a lot to me. But we love doing the show for you and we want to keep doing it. So please like, comment, whatever. Have a great day.
The views expressed on this episode do not necessarily reflect those of the show or the University of Texas. Please visit slavexradio.com for more information. Thank you for listening. The Slavic Connection is produced by the Center for Russian, East European, and Eurasian Studies at the University